So if you look at a really nice piece of jewelry or a really nice piece of eyewear or a wristwatch that's very well made, you'll notice that the beauty is in the details. And I think that's important because what it communicates to a customer is, well, if they put that level of thought into the little tiny details like this dial or bezel, imagine how much consideration they put into the rest of the product. This is an industrial design analysis with design theory. Today we're going to look at the Samsung Galaxy Note 20 collection that just dropped. I'm not going to be talking about specs or any sort of technical things. I'm only focusing on what the industrial design communicates to customers. So one of the main things that the designers were probably trying to communicate is a certain level of quality, a certain level of luxury and refinement. I think that's really consistent throughout the entire design. If you look at the website, they lead with design, which I think is really interesting. Before they talk about any features, before they talk about any sort of benefits, they immediately talk about the value of the design and the beauty of the design, which I think is interesting. So moving on to the silhouettes. We see some very, very simple, very elemental silhouettes here. They're just blocks, essentially. Even the watch, if you look at that outline, it is a very basic, traditional watch outline. For now, I kind of want to just focus on the phone itself as well as maybe the earbuds since they're the most interesting to me. So once again, looking at the outline of the phone, it's a very elemental block. And this does a few things. It communicates a certain sense of sturdiness. It feels strong. There aren't any sort of breaks in that silhouette or that form. It feels like one solid piece. It communicates that quality, that luxury, and refinement. Another thing that's interesting is that it's pretty monochromatic, and it tends to be a signal of luxury in the consumer electronics market. Rather than advertising the fact that this is made up of a bunch of discrete parts, a bunch of different parts that are assembled together, when you have this sort of monochrome aesthetic, it sort of makes it look like one whole solid piece, which makes it feel really strong and sturdy and durable, like it's going to last. It has all of the necessary details to feel like a luxury product, to feel like it was considered in its construction and design, but it still has that sturdiness to it in the silhouette and overall outline. The next thing are the subshapes, and this is where things get a lot more interesting. So the very first thing that I notice is the camera, and they have really made it a point to emphasize the camera. And I made another video about smartphone cameras and how the fact that all of these companies are pushing the visual language of the camera so much and putting so much visual emphasis on the cameras is sort of a reflection of sharing and social media culture. Companies know that this is what's important to people. Smartphone companies know that the camera is a major deciding factor in your purchase, and they're really emphasizing the camera because as soon as you make it look bigger, as soon as you bring attention to it, as soon as you add all of these bezels and details to it, it gives a more powerful appearance to it. It looks like a more robust camera. Now, what's interesting is that they have decided to make this camera stick out. It juts out from the rest of the device, which I think is really interesting. They have sacrificed utility purely for the sake of making a visual statement here, because it would make a lot more sense to have that be a bit more flat. It would fit into the pocket well, and it would make a lot more sense for a lot of other reasons. But they've chosen to actually elevate it up from the rest of the body. Now, I get it. There are probably engineering constraints. I get all that. But there are ways that they could have blended that camera with the main body in a much less conspicuous way. So let's take a closer look at the details of the back of this phone. So what we have as the backing is what looks to be some sort of a brushed metal surface. Then the camera area sort of juts into that very abruptly. There's no sort of blending of that surface. They're treated as two separate parts. Then there's a polished metal bezel around the rim of the camera area. Then on top of that, there's another material change with this glass. I think that the top of the camera area might be a different material from the back of the body. I'm pretty sure it is actually. So that creates even more contrast and even more detail. Then on top of that, there's a separate bezel for each camera lens, and it's a completely different material. So you just have details on details on details, really trying to emphasize that camera. The next thing you'll notice are the really fine tolerances and the really fine details of this design. So one thing that really makes it feel luxury is this material contrast here and the way that these two parts sort of merge together. One thing I notice about this entire collection is that it's sort of this move away from tech and a gravitation towards luxury. And this has been a bigger trend in consumer electronics for quite some time. People are drawn to human experiences, and they don't want something that feels very robotic and very gadgety. They want something that feels like it just sort of blends into their everyday life. So more specifically, the form intersections are sort of inspired by clasps or hardware that you'd find on wristwatches or jewelry or expensive purses and clutches. You don't really see this stuff as much in smartphones. So customers are probably making that subconscious association of luxury with this product, and for the price point, it really does need to communicate that. So if you look at a really nice piece of jewelry or a really nice piece of eyewear or a wristwatch that's very well made, you'll notice that the beauty is in the details. And I think that's important because what it communicates to a customer is, well, if they put that level of thought into the little tiny details like this dial or bezel, imagine how much consideration they put into the rest of the product. And this is why minor details matter. Even though nobody is actually going to consciously notice them, they do register on a subconscious level with the customer. And visually, when the details are the star of the show, it draws your eye into the product. You want to get closer to it and look at it. And the eye is drawn to the area of highest contrast, and there's just a lot of contrast in this area. This is what the designers wanted you to focus on when they were designing it. And that is what is really communicating luxury with this phone. And that's what's going to get people to spend $1,000 on the phone. Of course, the specs are important, don't get me wrong. And the overall quality of the software is critically important. It's probably the most important thing. But there needs to be consistency between the software experience and the hardware experience. The first impression that you get of this phone is going to be the way that it feels in your hand and the way that you touch it. Another thing that's interesting that I think is intentional, I would bet that it is that a lot of these smartphone cameras reference old film camera designs. The way that the lenses are sort of arranged is very reminiscent of old school film cameras that you'll see. I think that's important because all of the people who are able to afford this type of phone will make this very subconscious, deep association with quality and the fact that it's referencing these old film cameras that Dad used to have. My buddy Rafi actually pointed this out in another smartphone video that I did, and I think it's worth mentioning here. I also want to address the earbuds for a second here because I actually think they're pretty interesting. So I commend Samsung for moving away from the typical Apple AirPods form. Based on prior design work that I've done for devices that fit in the ear, I would bet that this design and form factor is going to fit a wider range of people and it's more ergonomic. I think that they managed to make a pretty elegant form that will probably fit very well in most people's ears. It's really sort of playing up that luxury aesthetic and that quality because these look like little polished gold nuggets or something. And there's this little form break here that really nicely catches the light and draws your eye in and creates that attention to detail, which is so important for these luxury products. And Samsung has done a pretty good job. I think that overall the smartphone market is kind of stagnated. It's sort of stuck in this place where we're just like arguing over the size of the notch and the chin and the screen size to bezel ratio. And I think that revolution is due to happen in this space, but I think it's going to take some time and it's going to require some articulating of some new user experiences and new use cases for these phones. So anyway, guys, I hope you guys found this helpful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. It does help me out, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.